Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to the worst podcast on the internet. My name is Dan, and here is my co-host, the worst man on the planet Earth, Chad.
The worst?
The worst. I'm second. It's fine.
Okay, I'll take that. At least I'm in good company.
Questionable.
Questionable company.
Yeah, and quite very questionable. And on today's episode of the Objectively Bad podcast, we're going to be talking about all things fantasy. I'll be completely transparent with the viewers. About 10 minutes ago, we had no idea what to talk about, and then my brain clicked, and I was like, hey, I don't think we've talked about this yet. And I recently watched Lord of the Rings, which we did talk about on a previous episode. But I've been very engulfed recently in watching all of the Lord of the Rings YouTube videos explaining the world to me, because a lot of things didn't make sense, or like there's a lot of stuff left out, because Tolkien wrote a fuck ton of things.
So much.
There's so much. And I thought, hey, what better time than to talk about phantasmical things than on a podcast?
Phantasmical things.
Yeah, what word am I trying to say? Phantasmal?
Fantastical.
That's the one.
Yeah.
I'm getting fantastical and phantasm mixed up.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
It happens to the best of us.
Yeah,
I guess.
Luckily, we're the worst of everyone.
That's true.
That is
we
true.
are the absolute worst.
Yeah, the absolute. Baldur's Gate, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. Oh my god, fantasy. It all links back.
It's all coming together, baby.
Yeah. So I guess we'll start with a question. A question that scholars among the ages have tried to answer for a millennia, or maybe just like 100 years or something. I don't know. And
some period of time.
What is the difference between high and low fantasy? Because we did a little bit of looking before the podcast, and no one can really seem to come to a consensus.
I think we're more confused than we were
honestly
prior to looking it up.
So, Chad, why don't you give a brief description of what typically is seen as high fantasy first? Because I think that's the more obvious one out of the two, for sure.
Let's see. A hard and fast definition that will never change.
Yep.
High fantasy is like, it's a world that has differing rules from our own, typically that involve magic, although sometimes they can involve, usually it's some form of magic that is maybe explained in a certain way. Maybe they have a differing like god system or like deity system. They will typically have multiple species that are usually relatively sentient, instead of, for us, it's pretty much just humans and some birds. I mean, there are a lot of things with sentience, but like humanoid aspects where they can gain like human-like intelligence, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They'll have stuff like that. They'll have a magic system. A lot of times it's completely different worlds. So, there's different maps, there's different landscapes. Yeah, I would say that's how I would explain high fantasy. And also, I guess there's a good point of differentiating from sci-fi. Everything that is new or powerful is usually magically explained rather than scientifically explained.
Yep, exactly. I think like you can have science in sci-fi, in fantasy. Like,
sure, I would agree.
I think from what I know, from the fantasy I know, the best example is probably the Elder Scrolls. Because in this Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, any of the games, you have the Dwemer, who are an ancient race of dwarves that have like super advanced technology. Like they invented from what
basically
we theorize, robots. We think they invented like time travel to some degree. Or like they cracked. There's a theory in Skyrim they cracked the code for like immortality, and then a god punished them, and that's why they're erased from existence.
Yeah.
But like it's obviously the Elder Scrolls is not a sci-fi. But you can still have really cool tech like that. I don't know if there are many other examples I can think of. Like, I know in like Baldur's Gate, like the Githyanki, who are an alien race from outside the world, have like technology, like pretty advanced, like ships that can fly through the universe and stuff. But it's still a fantasy world at its core.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like you'll get almost like a steampunk that still feels fantasy, or you'll have like, I don't know, like dwarves will have like automata and that kind of stuff, where like everything else is still fantasy, but they maybe mix in sci-fi elements that work in a fantasy world. Because again, a lot of times they go, oh, well, how does this work? And you kind of just go magic, or you go magical object.
Yeah, I think
or that
I think
sort of thing.
Probably what it comes down to is even if there is technology, it's based on magic. Like the best example in recent history is Arcane. Arcane, they create technology through the use of these magic runes. And basically magic is like the electricity of their worlds. That's like the best way to explain it, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's like the main difference. And obviously the best high fantasy examples you could probably think of are things like Lord of the Rings, where there's a little bit of debate, but it's mostly high fantasy. Stuff like the Elder Scrolls. Game of Thrones, I feel like is probably high fantasy.
I feel like, I don't see why it would
gotta be, I think. Those like if there are elves, it's probably high fantasy. That's probably the easiest way to look at it, to be honest. If there are elves and magic, like high level
There's
magic.
elves and magics and forests.
Forests. Yeah, the
forests.
real world.
I don't know why forests just feel right.
Yeah.
I think it's that we started, I guess if we wanted to get into low fantasy, we started looking into definitions of low fantasy. Because I feel like a lot of our examples that we have in media are, when you think fantasy, it's almost always high fantasy.
Pretty
it's
much.
Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
It's Skyrim. It's The Witcher.
Yeah,
Baldur's
which is another
Gate,
good
Dungeons
example.
and Dragons. All of that's high fantasy. And I think that's almost because low fantasy, God, the definition was often that it would change, but I saw one that was like, it has to take place on Earth and it has fantastical elements, but is otherwise a normal Earth. I think the easiest way you could do that is like a modern day, and then you throw in some characters have magic.
Yes,
like
like Harry Potter, Sorcerer's Apprentice, Percy Jackson are probably like the more typical low fantasy things you can have. But even then, people debate about it.
People debate about Harry Potter. They're like, oh, well, actually, it creates a bunch of stuff within the world. I would say it's more low fantasy.
I think so,
because it very much exists in the regular world. There's just a lot of fantastical elements that are added. But like, there are people with cars and cell phones, and they're in trains, and they go to a zoo.
Well, like, I don't know if you've seen it, but I'm gonna have to find the name of it. There's a British TV show, Misfits, I think it's called.
Oh, yeah.
Well, like,
I've seen that.
It's kind of fantasy. There's also there was a new Netflix show that came out last year where it's a bunch of British people, again, they get superpowers. Can't remember the name of it. And now we're stretching to another sort of line where it's low fantasy and then there's superhero stuff, which is also like a bit of friction there as to what's what. Because I'll give an example from the anime realm. My Hero Academia is the regular world. They're in Tokyo, but I think it's like 75% of all people have a quirk, which is like a superpower. Now, there's also a weird distinction between what's a superpower and what's magic, because sometimes it's very close as to which is which. Because you have people like Doctor Strange who use magic, but then you have people like Scarlet Witch who have very similar powers. It's probably more of a superpower. So like, I guess Marvel is probably actually a good example of low fantasy, maybe, but then it's also superhero. Like there's both.
Yeah, and it's also sci-fi.
It's
I think, because I don't think fantasy is just defined by having magic. I think the most basic definition is you go, fantasy is in the past, sci-fi is in the future, but like not, I guess that's the most clear kind of cut way to do it.
Like Dune is sci-fi, is it not? And that's not
100%.
That's not past or future. That's on a different alien planet.
It's a different, But I think it's more the question of like, is the technology, normal technology, stuff that is not driven by magic, is it more advanced or less advanced than the current day?
Because if you're talking about time, because you mentioned there, like people say fantasy's past, sci-fi's future. Isn't like the opening line of Star Wars up like a very long time ago? So
the more we try to define this, I think the worse it gets.
Yeah, I think like I was saying before the podcast, the easiest way to define it may not be clean cut, but the easiest way is probably, does it take place in our timeline on Earth? Yes or no? If no, it's
for low
probably
fantasy.
For low fantasy.
Yeah.
If no, it's probably high fantasy. If yes, it's probably low. But then again, with the whole definition of is it on Earth, you run into another issue because with Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, the author, has stated it is Earth in the past. So like
way far in the past, but now you can also sit here and go, yes, that's what Tolkien said, but technically speaking, that like
it's obviously not.
It's obviously not because we don't have any of those things. You could maybe move your definition to it has to be on like on Earth in a recorded period of time.
Yep.
Because like with Star Wars, you go, oh, it's a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago. Or whatever, however it goes. But also like it's also that's a little different because it's in a not here.
Yeah.
But it's galaxy. Like with Tolkien, it's you know, it's way far in the past that we don't know. It's like, okay, cool, that's high fantasy because it doesn't have real elements.
Yeah, well, I think from the videos I've been watching, Lord of the Rings is meant to have taken place roughly 6,000 years ago, which we
really
apparently yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I thought it was gonna be like millions of years.
No, apparently, because like if you look at the map, the like more drawn out map, you can actually see like the continents. You can kind of see that like Middle Earth is like Eastern Europe and Africa, pretty much. Western Europe and Africa. Because Tolkien was talking about, someone asked him a question, because he used to do a bunch of like written answers to questions after the books were made to fans. And one of them, I don't have this exactly down, but they roughly said that in Lord of the Rings, you're in the Third Age, and the end of the movies spark the start of the Fourth Age.
Yeah.
So they were asking him, what does the fifth, sixth, and seventh age of Middle Earth looks like? And Tolkien's answer was, I think he said the seventh age or the sixth age of Middle Earth begins with the birth of Jesus Christ, leading into where we are now. And there's only about 1,000 years in between the different ages. So by that, it means that Lord of the Rings takes place about 6,000 years ago. And we know from our history, 6,000 years ago, the world didn't look like that. We have evidence of it. So it's sort of like
there were no Ents.
There were no Ents that we know of.
True.
But like Tolkien did say that hobbits still exist. We just don't see them because they hide, which is kind of cute. It's kind of funny.
It is kind of funny. It's also a cop out. I'm gonna be honest. Tolkien, you're great. That's a cop out.
He does say that it's like I can't remember the exact word he used, but it's like Earth, but seen in a different way. Is like the way he describes it. And you could also say like Harry Potter. Like it's one of those weird things, but like with Harry Potter, there's no way to prove magic doesn't exist if they're good enough at hiding it.
Well, yeah, their whole thing is they just go, either they don't let muggles see anything, or they just erase their memories and go, oh yeah, you didn't. Or they convince you not, you know, it's same with Percy Jackson, where they're like, I think they say real people can't see any of the like mythical creatures. And so it's chalked up to like phenomenon. And like just weird stuff happening.
It's same with like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, very famous anime. They have like these stands, which are basically like abilities that like present themselves in like a person that they use, kind of.
Yeah.
Best way to describe it. And like regular people can't see them. So like when they're fighting, you have like the two main characters that just stand there, and their characters basically fight each other. They can see them, no one else can. And there'd be no way to prove that, you know, they have powers or anything happens. Yeah. And there's a lot of low fantasy that does do that, where it does play the card like, oh, regular people just don't see what's happening, or they do the Hogwarts thing where they go to a place where no one else can get to.
Yeah.
Whereas high fantasy is typically just another world where everyone is involved in the high fantasy. Low fantasy, it typically feels that maybe sometimes not everyone's involved, or the secrets. Again, we're getting into a rabbit hole here. It's so difficult to define.
I feel like high fantasy is all the rules and all the magic and all the creatures are equally spread amongst people. Like everyone either knows about it or has some amount of it, or like there's multiple races and they're widespread, and there's a lot of them. Where like low fantasy is almost like there's a group of people that are involved in this, and the rest is real life. And honestly, the more I'm thinking about it, the more I think a lot of it is that thing where it's like, oh, well, the rest of the world doesn't even know about it, because then you'd have to start to explain magic.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, well, is magic teachable? Is it just something you have? Do you just have the people who are magical just take over the world because they're like, I'm more powerful?
Yeah.
And I think you see that a lot in superhero stuff, which is almost why I want superhero in quotes to be like its own genre.
Yeah, well, like I guess another good example is that you watch Jujutsu Kaisen, which is, I think, a pretty good, like, low fantasy example.
Yeah, I would say so.
Like, you could easily replace Jujutsu Kaisen with superheroes and it wouldn't change anything about the story, but I think it's very important that it is magic and, like, abilities rather than superpowers, which, again, the distinction is so, like, thin. Because, like, even in, like, stuff like Marvel and DC, you have characters that can use magic, like Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, but, like, with JJK, it's a normal world. There are characters that can use jujitsu, magic, basically.
Yeah.
And they get, like, there's only a few of them, and they awaken powers either at birth or by eating fingers. And then they're taken to this other world where they see things that regular people can't, for the most part. I think that's, like, the best way to describe it. Again, the definition's so difficult because, like, every story is kind of unique and portrays it in different ways. There are also low fantasy stories where, like, everyone is involved and they can see it, but it's, like, a low invested part of the world. Like, it's...
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I can't think of any good examples, but I'm sure there are low fantasy stories out there where, like, it's a completely regular world, but some people can just, like, use fire magic.
Or I could even see, and again, I can't think of an example either, where you have a low fantasy world where, like, it's basically the real world and no one is really magical, but then some magical item appears or some magical being appears, and you have, like, regular people doing this. And I guess that's where it can toe the line between sci-fi and fantasy. And I think it's purely how it's presented, because, like, an alien movie where it's like, oh, aliens are taking over the world, that could be on a really similar plane. Like, that would be low sci-fi, where it's like, there's not, like, it's mostly Earth, but there's a sci-fi event happening. I think the same could be said with fantasy. I'm just trying to think of how that would come about. Or, like, I can't think of an example.
Yeah, so I brought up a Reddit post here, and obviously this isn't the source for what low fantasy is.
This is a credible source.
But he gives some good bullet points about, like, what low fantasy could entail. So anything set in our world, fantasy with little or no fantastical elements. So, like, minimal, like, crazy stuff going on, basically. Like, no elves is the best example. It's the best way to define it. Fantasy concerned with more day-to-day things rather than saving the world. That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
So, like, people using magic for their commute to work rather than defeating the demon lord, I guess.
Yeah, or, oh gosh, that is kind of, it is kind of fun to see that, because I feel like you don't see it often, because there's always, and especially high fantasy, it's this big fantastical, like, oh my god, we have to slay the dragon and take all the treasure. There's the big bad and we have to take him down or the world's gonna end. We're like, just a little, like, oh, I'm a guy that uses magic for slight inconveniences in my life. And, like, I think it'd be fun. And again, I'm sure there is something like this, but I don't know how popular it is, of a low fantasy where it's not an action adventure. Because that's the other thing, is we almost always get in popular media action adventure, where, like, a drama or like a rom-com where this one guy could, like, use magic.
Well, so I just thought of something. We're throwing a spanner in the works here. We're blowing it wide open. So we did look at a list before the video about, like, the 12 best fantasy shows or whatever, and one that came up is Lost.
Okay.
I started watching Lost recently because I was watching another show from the same team called From, and they're actually, if you think about it, pretty good examples of a low fantasy. There's no magic. Well, there's weird things happening, oh, this is the best way to explain
but
it.
It's not defined.
It's not like, oh, this guy can use telekinesis or fire magic.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, like in From, for example, and if you don't want spoilers, skip ahead. In From, the basic plot line, and you'll know this from episode 1, is you start with a family, they're on a road trip, they drive into a tree that's fallen down on the highway, so they have to turn around. Once they turn around, they drive through a town, and the guy says, keep going this way to get back on the highway, keeps driving, and then he's back in the town again, and then back in the town again, and back in the town again. That's a fantastical element. That's not something that happens in the real world. And then you find out there are like these monster creatures that kill people at night. And then you find out that people are having weird dreams and seeing visions of things. That is fantasy, which leads me to the next point. Is a zombie movie a fantasy movie?
Oh my god.
It probably...
Okay, here's the deal. I think this is where we go back to sci-fi. How are they turned into zombies?
It's a good
Probably
point.
some biological disease turns into sci-fi.
Yeah.
Because I think when it's unexplained or explained purely by just saying it's some cosmic energy or like it's a power from a deity, then it's fantasy. But if you go, oh, like, you know, The Last of Us, we have a ton of zombies. That's a fantastical thing. But, oh, it's because of this fungus. Then they start putting science into it, whether or not it's real or not. But they put the idea of science, it becomes sci-fi.
But it is interesting how like thin that line is, because if you have a zombie film,
It can be quite
where
thin.
the explanation is, oh, a god or made these zombies.
Yeah, that's
then it's
fantasy.
Fantasy, even
And
though
that's
it's the
the
exact
thing
same
is-
plot line.
And I think there's a lot of stuff where like sci-fi and fantasy sometimes almost are just how it's presented and not necessarily changing. Now, there's obviously some things like Star Trek where it's like, that's very definitively sci-fi. They're in spaceships and they're flying around and they're using all this technology. And you have Lord of the Rings, which is so like clearly fantasy. But I think there's a lot of in-betweens where it's like, if this was presented in a different way and absolutely nothing else, it turns into fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I pose you this question. You mentioned that Star Trek is very clearly fantasy. In the world of Dungeons and Dragons, there's a race called the Githyanki who also fly on spaceships and travel throughout space in ways that shouldn't be possible, but their spaceships are powered by magic. So if Star Trek was the exact same movie, but they just had a little line at the beginning saying all our spaceships are powered by this magic orb, is it now fantasy?
Yes, if they also keep that up with everything else. And I think it's that they do a lot of things by explaining it through, oh, it's science. I also think to some degree, I hate to say it, like the vibe is different, but because that just fucking means anything.
Yep.
But I do think there is a different kind of, I guess, feeling to how they work with the fantastical elements in the world. Because when it's fantasy on it, a lot of times it's like it's magic, so it's graceful and it's I don't know, elves. Goes back to elves.
Goes back to elves.
Even though there's elves in sci-fi, where I feel like in sci-fi it's like we have to change the data port into the, you know.
Yeah.
It's a little more nerd-like.
Whereas in fantasy, it's like, oh, we have to rearrange these magic crystals and the runes need to be in the correct order. Like another great example that I know we're getting to fantasy sci-fi now, which we're meant to be doing fantasy high low, but Arcane, very great show that came out recently in the League of Legends universe, which is a very fantasy world. But in Arcane, they make a lot of technology which looks very sci-fi, but then is powered by a rune, which is magic. So it's
oh god, I don't know.
It's so interesting. Before we get into a rabbit hole, let me go through these other bullet points because I have some other interesting talking points.
Okay.
So the next one is that fantasy about what low fantasy is defined by.
Yes.
Is a fantasy about common people rather than nobility or other important people.
I don't think that necessarily applies.
It is interesting though.
I think you could. It is interesting.
Because you look at Lord of the Rings and it's like, oh, we have the elves, we have the king, we have this god-like being with Gandalf. Then you look at low fantasy, and Harry Potter is just by definition a random kid.
Yes and no. He is also kind of a celebrity, which in a modern day is royalty.
Yeah,
to a degree. So I don't know if I necessarily agree. I'd say there's probably a lot of correlation to like, it's probably a lot more of like nobility in high fantasy than there is in low fantasy.
High fantasy usually takes from like older time periods in the world where there are kings and queens and things, whereas low fantasy, I'm sure there can be low fantasy from like the 1500s, but most of it is like modern-ish.
It's probably mostly modern, I'd say, or roughly modern.
Yep. Next point, and this is more, this is less so about the world building and more about how it's presented. It's about having complicated prose, complicated wording. Lord of the Rings famously has a lot of very complex writing, whereas something like Harry Potter doesn't. I don't know if that's more of a writing style or it does lend itself to the genre.
I feel like that's really just coincidental.
But you also think about like sci-fi.
I kind of see it
Sci-fi
though.
has a lot of like really complex language and jargon because like, oh, the data transfer,
that's true,
flux capacitor bullshit, and like you have to learn a bunch of these terms to understand the world you're in. Same with high fantasy, you have to learn a lot of these, like what the fuck is what's the ball they use in Lord of the Rings? The Pantis, it starts with the P. The magic
Palantir?
ball. Yeah, that.
Yeah, like it's still in the dome. I still got it.
You have to learn what that. You have to learn what a Maya is to understand who Gandalf is. Like, I guess you could argue in Harry Potter.
I guess in a high fantasy, I guess from that, in a high fantasy, there is a lot more definition to the world. But I'd say there's a decent amount of definition to Harry Potter. Harry Potter is also technically a kid's
I guess
book.
it's that with high fantasy, you have to learn more about the world to understand it, whereas low fantasy, it's usually in our world, so you understand a lot of it more so instantly.
You just have to learn about the unique things about the specifics, but everything else is the modern world. I guess that's true.
Is that
I feel
a way?
Like the writing
is that a way you could is that a way you could define it? Like a fantasy, you have to learn about a world. Whereas high fantasy, you have to learn about a whole new world. Whereas low fantasy, you have to learn about the differences in our world.
Maybe. The problem is I feel like I almost need just more. I feel like we're going off examples, or at least that's how I'm doing this, because I'm thinking of Harry Potter and Percy Jackson mainly as the two. One example I saw was Good Omens, which I thought was interesting as well.
I mean, like Lost as well. Like Lost is probably fantasy. Like people crash on an island and a bunch of weird, mysterious things happen that can't be explained scientifically, really.
Yeah.
That's probably fantasy. Like, I'm trying to, because there are definitely fantasy, like Stranger Things. Is that fantasy? It would be, right? I haven't watched much of it, but like that sounds.
Yeah, that would be that actually probably would be low fantasy.
Yep.
Because it takes place in a very distant past, the 80s. No, I'm kidding. It takes place in relatively modern era, and a lot of the creatures that are the mythical part are based on D&D, which is fantasy. And there's I don't think science is, I mean, there's like scientists that study them, but I don't think they've really been able to explain anything outside of science.
Yeah, and like surely a lot of horror movies like The Conjuring and It would also be fantasy.
You could make an argument that a lot of fantasy or a lot of horror is low fantasy.
Yeah, because like The Conjuring, you like ghosts and stuff, even though people in real life do believe in ghosts, like there's no scientific proof for them, so they are like fantastical. So you could argue that. The other point I made before the podcast, which I find really funny, any Christmas movie with Santa is arguably low fantasy.
But we've talked about elves. How does that come into our definition? our true hard and fast definition that low fantasy can't physically have an elf.
There are different types of. There are high elves and there are low elves, aren't there?
Oh, true. These are short elves. They don't count.
Exactly.
I think you could have elves in low fantasy. I just
you could.
I think they'd have. You have it. Okay, I'm pretty. Are elves in Harry Potter? Nope. They have other species in Harry Potter.
What's Dobby? He's a goblin, right?
He's a house elf. Yeah, he's an elf.
Oh, house elf. Yep.
Yeah, because he's a house. Yeah, there are elves in Harry. Yeah, because there's house elves. I think that might be about it. That has been described. I don't think they've necessarily said it's the only one.
I mean, maybe this is the definition. In high fantasy, elves are like these beautiful, celestial, gorgeous beings. In low fantasy, they're little goblin creatures.
They're little goblin boys.
Oh god. Moving on to the next point, which is similar to what we're talking about. Fantasy about short people like dwarves, halflings, and gnomes is typically more high fantasy.
That, again, that feels too specific.
Yeah.
Because you could say the same thing about really tall people. I don't fucking know. Again, also there are short beings in Harry Potter. Yeah.
So it's very difficult to get a definition, to be honest. I don't think we ever will. Oh, hold up. I found some more points that are maybe more... They're more like definitions. It looks like they was taken from a website. So, number 1... Intrusion fantasy, where something fantastic in an otherwise normal primary world, like our own, is a low fantasy. So intrusion fantasy, where something fantastical happens to the regular world, which is what we've been saying.
It's intruding on the regular world. I actually think I like intrusion fantasy better.
As a term.
It's more... A low fantasy is easy because you have high fantasy, low fantasy. The comparison's easy. Yeah. But the word intrusion fantasy, I think, sets the definition apart a lot better.
Yeah.
Because like Harry Potter, like Percy Jackson, it is otherwise a normal world, but something is intruding on it.
That's actually, I think that's a really good way to explain a lot of them. Obviously, there are some low fantasy that are probably not described in that way. Like there are probably some low fantasy where like the whole world does have some magic power, but it's still regular. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure it exists out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And then the other second definition they give here is low magic fantasy, where the usage comes from the role-playing game world.
What?
Okay, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
I don't know what that means. Like Magic the Gathering?
I guess. Let's just stick with intrusion fantasy. That makes more sense.
Yeah. I think the problem is a lot of times when you try to define it, you're taking examples from particular examples of high fantasy and then comparing them and going, oh, well, they're not in low fantasy. Therefore, like the dwarves thing, like, oh, there's not typically shorter races. I think you could chalk that more up to like, there is typically the main race is human. And if there are any other main races, are any other races, it's not as prevalent. But again, I go back to Harry Potter. Harry Potter is an interesting one.
Well, it's still
because
not
there is quite a big world within Harry Potter that is all mythical. It just also takes place in the real world.
Yeah, but like I don't know Harry Potter well enough, but I can't imagine the overall population of the magical beings is even more than like the population of like an average European country. It's still not a majority. Compared to...
It is not a majority. I think it is like a pretty stark minority.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting because they don't interact with... Like, they do interact with normal people.
Yeah.
Muggles in their terminology. But, like, not a whole lot.
No, not to a massive degree. Which is, like... This brings me back to Lord of the Rings again. With what Tolkien said about progressing into the 7th Age, which is Earth. He says that after the defeat of Sauron, after the ring gets thrown into the volcano, magic slowly starts to fade away from the world because the rings were actually the things that were keeping magic in the world. Once they were destroyed, the elves all left. They lost their magic. The dwarves burrowed deeper into the grounds and were never really seen again. And the hobbits also just didn't really interact with anyone. So after about like 200 years, 250 years after the Lord of the Rings, you end up in a world that is all humans, basically no magic. So it ends up just being sort of like looking like the 1200s in Europe. Like, and now you don't really have fantasy anymore. It's now just myths. And if you look
it's now just medieval stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all just tales that are told.
Yeah, which feels similar to what our world is like. We have tales of dragons, we have tales of cyclopses, but there's no proof of them anymore.
No proof of them.
So high fantasy can become
kind of interesting.
Can become a low or not even a fantasy anymore, depending on how the world turns out, which is really interesting.
True. Yeah, I don't. Low fantasy is a hard one because I think I just don't think it's as defined as well as high fantasy. And it's because when you introduce a fantasy element into the real world, at what point have you introduced too many elements that it stops being low fantasy?
Yep.
I think is the issue that comes.
Or
because like with Harry Potter,
fantasy.
Yeah, in Harry Potter, if they were just wizards and that was it, easy, low fantasy, done, boom. But there's also dragons and goblins and house elves and a lot of like mythical creatures, which I think at the start of this video, I said that helps define high fantasy.
Yep.
So yeah, and like I looked at like Wikipedia and their definition was pretty quick. I guess I could pull that up.
No, it is. It's. I think, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, I think it just ends up being similar to a lot of things in the real world that we talk about in 2025. It's on a spectrum.
It is.
There's not a clear-cut line, really. There are some things that are very high fantasy, some things that are close to the middle line, and then some things that are very low fantasy. But there doesn't really seem to be a clear-cut line, because like, where do you, like with something like Harry Potter, like you said, if they were just wizards and they went to like this
low fantasy
school, fine. But now we're introducing all these creatures that are very much high fantasy.
Yeah. But it's at the same time, I don't feel right calling it high fantasy. It's almost mid fantasy.
Yeah. It's fucking mid, am I right, boys?
It's mid as fuck.
Mid as hell.
Yeah, let's see. This is what Wikipedia says. Low fantasy or intrusion fantasy, which I do like, is a subgenre of fantasy fiction in which magical events intrude on an otherwise normal world.
Yeah, that's the definition I read off from Reddit.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so same thing. But then like the examples Wikipedia gives is, I'm going to read all of these. The Borrowers, The Dark is Rising, The Doll's House, Five Children and It, Good Omens, The Indian in the Cupboard, The Snow Spider, The Hideous Strength, Tuck Everlasting.
Yeah, apart from Good Omens, I've not heard of a single one of those.
Apart from Good Omens, I've never heard of a fucking single one of those. I don't know why they all feel British.
They probably are.
They might be. They just weirdly, for me, they feel like they're all British. I don't know why. That doesn't mean anything. That's not a commentary or anything. I just feel like they are. It also says like low fantasy is related to a number of other genres or subgenres. Urban fantasy, which I feel like their definition is urban fantasy takes place in a modern urban as opposed to rural or historical setting, and thus can be viewed as a type of low fantasy. I feel like everything we have offered has been urban fantasy, which makes me then think, again, what is low fantasy? I
honestly think we should just stop using low fantasy. Intrusion fantasy is a much better term. It makes so much more sense.
The other thing I could think of is something that is a medieval story, in that it's, because I think classically fantasy is like swords and shields and bows and and like the kind of like 1200s, 1000, that kind of thing where you have knights and you have catapults and castles and all of that. And I think another form of low fantasy could be, it's a medieval world, it's mostly just people attacking, but there is a very low amount of magic. Maybe it's one enemy has magic, or there is a magical thing happening.
Or another, I don't know if this would be low fantasy as well, but screw magic. What about just like these instances where people do things that are like just a bit beyond what humans can actually do? The best, I know you haven't watched this, but there's an anime called Vinland Saga.
Yeah.
It is relatively historically accurate in the fact that a lot of the characters in there are real characters, or like they're based off real people, and it's based off the Icelandic and Norwegian invasion and takeover of England in like the early Viking ages. I can't remember, like year 1000 or something. And it's like, for the most part, it's like everyone, like they use knives, bows, it's all normal. But you have some characters, like the main character, or like this big guy called Thorkel, who's like fucking massive, and he can like throw like this giant wooden like log with a sharpened end at the end. He threw it like a fucking 500 meters at like supersonic speeds and like killed 20 people with one hit. That's not normal. That's a fantastical thing to have like that superhuman level of strength. But bar that, there's no magic in the show. There's no other creatures. It's only humans. Is that fantasy? Is that low fantasy as well?
Maybe, but it guesses. I wonder how much we might be towing the line between fantasy and just historical / medieval, or I guess historical, because medieval's one point in time.
But it's historical, but with massive like embellishments on like how strong people are or how fast they are.
Okay, so let me pull up. I don't know why it's pulling me to Wikipedia. I guess I should just go to a dictionary. Although we'll see how well it does, because sometimes honestly Wikipedia does a good job of explaining some of the more
Wikipedia's good, kids. Don't listen to your teachers.
Wikipedia's good. But when they ask you what you use, don't say Wikipedia. Go to the bottom. It has all of its references, and usually the references are good. Anyways, the power or process of creating a special... Okay, that doesn't really help me. I need fantasy as a genre. Fuck it, we're going back to Wikipedia. Merriam-Webster wasn't doing it for me. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction which involves themes of the supernatural, magic, and imaginary worlds and creatures. I think it's that fantasy a lot of times is applied to knights and castles and that sort of shit.
Yep.
But I think it doesn't actually have to be that. I also think a big thing that a lot of people mention is Tolkien did so much... damage isn't the word I want to use because I don't think it's a bad thing, but the work of Tolkien had massive consequences on what fantasy was seen as.
Yep.
Because it is seen as that. Like, so many people are taking that sort of kind of medieval world with elves, with orcs, with all that, and using that. Like Dungeons and Dragons does it.
Yeah, The Witcher, Skyrim.
Oh, like...
it would be great to see like a fantasy world, a high fantasy world, but like the 1920s. That'd be cool as hell.
Yeah.
But like how because Tolkien's work has inspired so much, it's almost impossible for me to think what that even looked like. Like I can't fathom what like a 1920s fantasy world would look like.
Yeah. I also think so the next line is its roots are in oral traditions which become fantasy literature and drama. Another big reason why it tends to go, it almost toys the line with historical work, is that a lot of its roots are in traditions which come from history. So a lot of it, because like you get like maybe like a fantasy like Japanese world, but that still feels semi-similar in the sense of it's historical, and then they maybe throw like demons or other supernatural things.
Well, if we're talking about just fantasy in general, One Piece is probably one of the best examples of a fantasy world that's not necessarily medieval, because in One Piece there are guns, there's like decent technology in there. They have like flying machines. They have they're like robots, and like in One Piece. It's weird because I'd almost argue One Piece is a mix of low and high fantasy, even though it's a different world. Because in One Piece, the geography of the world is that you have the big grand line in the middle, which is this stretch of ocean that like most people, you can't get into it. It's very difficult to get into. And inside there is where most of the people with powers and stuff reside. Outside of that grand line, you have 4 oceans, the north, east, south, and west blue seas. In there, it's pretty like normal. Like there are still pirates and stuff, but like the devil fruits, which are the things that give people powers in One Piece, if you don't live inside the Grand Line, it's the people don't believe they exist. They think it's a myth. Like there is maybe like a dozen of people within the like millions of populations in these islands that have these powers. So people just don't even think they exist, which is very low fantasy-esque in a sense.
Yeah.
But then you go into the Grand Line, and then it's very high fantasy. But it's not necessarily all medieval, because you have like one of the islands is Japanese, is feudal Japan. One of the islands is like very Spanish oriented. Another one of them that we're on at the moment or just finished is like a scientific futuristic world where like this great scientist who is based off Einstein has robots and like machines that like dress you and like create food instantaneously, and it's like it looks like something from Meet the Robinsons, which I watched recently.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
But it's not necessarily all medieval, which is, you know, it's something very different, which is cool, and I like it. I mean, like, again, there's we're gonna get into it. We're gonna keep circling around on this topic because it's kind of impossible to really define.
I think this episode is people watching us try and slowly define fantasy and also get more confused about it at the same time.
I think honestly we should tie a bow on this topic. High fantasy, different world for the most part, has a bunch of fantastical creatures. Everyone's involved with the understanding that magic and these fantastical elements exist. Low fantasy, for the most part, takes place in our world, is intrusive on the real life, and a minimal amount of people have magic or understanding or access to that part of the world.
And then the caveat, it's a spectrum. Fuck you, figure it out.
Yeah. We'll leave it at that, and let's move on to the next thing that we can talk about, which is I just want to go over what our favorite fantasy worlds are and sort of what maybe some of our favorite tropes in them, some things we think make them good, some things we think make them bad. Period.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know what to do with that.
Me neither.
I guess nothing.
Yeah.
I guess we just move on.
And I'll start us off with one thing that just popped in my head, which is probably one of my favorite elements of fantasy worlds, and that is the typical like pantheon of gods that come with fantasy worlds. Which is kind of funny because I think Lord of the Rings, even though they've inspired so much, only has like one god, technically.
Lord of the Rings is one of those where it's. I think there's I don't know. It's like they have beings that are like clearly above people, but they're not necessarily ever called gods. Like there's one.
They have one.
I think honestly, to some degree, you can kind of see Tolkien's actual religious beliefs kind of creep into this.
Yes.
Which is fine. That's fine. But a lot of times I find with fantasy worlds, they typically go more into the Norse, Greek, Egyptian,
Indian, Japanese,
Hindi, like where there's multiple gods. They're usually the god of this thing. And in a lot of like these cultures, it's used to explain why something is happening in the world that they don't know about. So like, oh, the waves are huge today. Poseidon's pissed.
Yep.
Or like, oh man, there's a bunch of like, there's a thunderstorm. Zeus is mad about something. Yep. And I love that because it humanizes these gods into like, they're all powerful beings and they're all shitheads. Like they're not these like perfect, like omnipotent, omniscient beings that are like, I know all and I know what must be done and I know how we should do this. It's like, no, they're just people with a lot of power.
Yeah.
And some of them are responsible, but a lot of times they're not. And that's kind of the best part.
So that's I'm going to put this out here. I'm not a religious man, but from an objective standpoint, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are the most boring fucking religions ever. It's It's just one guy.
One guy.
Arguably three, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, whatever. But like, compare that to Norse mythology. It's so much cooler, dude.
More interesting.
It's so much more interesting. Like, you have like gods with different like reasons for doing what they do, different power sets, different relationships with each other. It's so much more interesting where you have like, like in the Christian religion, like, God created the earth and he controls everything. Whereas in Greek mythology, it's like, Zeus is the god of all gods, but he has this child who controls thunder, and he has this other kid that controls the seas, and he hates them both, so he punishes them by killing their wives and fucking their children, which I'm sure probably happened. Greek mythology is weird.
Greek mythology is a lot of, I'm sure other mythologies are, but Greek mythology is a lot of like, it's a lot of gods, but I feel like Zeus in particular disguising himself as literally anything to have sex with other things. Yep. Whether that is like, that's also, I feel like women and men, just like anything he can get his hands on.
Yeah, he's a horny bugger.
He's a horny bastard. I feel like a lot of them are.
Yeah, but talking about going back to fantasy worlds, obviously the fantasy worlds I'm most familiar with is the Elder Scrolls. And like in the Elder Scrolls, you have the system of the Aedra and the Daedra, basically the good gods and the evil gods. And I think it's a really cool system because you have, you know, the god of the harvest and the god of love, Mara. But then you have like the evil gods, which not only gives you a cool conflict between good and evil, which you need, like God and the devil is a thing as well, but it gives you a lot of really cool story elements and ways to write. Like in Oblivion, the big conflict is the Oblivion Crisis, which is where this big god, Molag Bal, the most evil and despicable of all gods, tries to invade the earth. A very cool plotline. But then in Skyrim, you have a bunch of like mini things. You have like Mehrunes Dagon, who's another very evil god that tries to get you to kill people. Or you have Clavicus Vile, who like does a lot of little plots and stuff. You also have
he's a little trickster boy.
You have like the goddess of disease who tries to fucking poison you. And it's a lot more like interesting little things, and you can write a lot of small little different stories all around these, rather than just having like the big, oh, he's evil plots. You have a lot of you have more intricacy in it, basically, is what I'm trying to say, which makes it way more cool, in my opinion.
There's a lot of times more reasons for why they are evil, and also varying levels of how evil they are. Because some of them are like, I'm the god of chaos, I am pure evil. And some of them are like, I just like messing with people.
Yeah. Like Sheogorath.
Like
he's basically just a jester that has powers.
Yeah.
So I'm a fuck with you. I'm a fun.
God. What's the guy that gives you the Jabberwock?
Sheogorath.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Where he's like, I'm just gonna mess with people and we're gonna have a fun time here.
Yeah, or like there are even in Skyrim, there are some Daedra that are like arguably even good. Like Azura.
Yeah.
Is like arguably helps you in a way. Like she still does bad things, but in Skyrim at least, the Daedra aren't necessarily evil. They're just gods that decided not to be a part of the pantheon that created the world.
Yeah.
They basically just like went away. They're almost just like a fucking militia or something. Like basically a group that doesn't want to be with the government for the most part. And you have the same thing with D&D. I've been playing Baldur's Gate 3 again recently, so I know a bit about it.
Nice.
Not a whole lot. But like, for example, one of the goddesses, Shah, is just the god of darkness and loss. And the whole thing is she wants to bring love and happiness through loss and sacrifice and forgetting memory. She's like the best way you can find happiness is to forget, which I don't think is a good thing, but they see it as that way. And again, it's a more intricate way of having a sort of evil in the world rather than just, oh, I'm gonna kill you because I'm big and red and scary.
Because I'm mad and evil. I think a cool fantasy trope that I like is portraying death in a sympathetic way.
Yeah.
In like, not in a way of like, oh, death, evil, like dying is bad, so death is evil. It's like, no, they're just bringing you on into the afterlife, or like they're letting you pass from the mortal plane to a different plane, like that sort of thing.
Like with Sovngarde, or like in the real world villages, like Valhalla. Like if you die gloriously in battle, you'll be rewarded with this spiritual place that's all good and you can eat meat and drink beer all day.
Yeah. And so it's not like death is evil, because it's almost death comes for you when it's your time, not it. Death decides that it's your time. Like, death is just there to do. And I also think I always find it can often be interesting when something that's always characterized as bad can be shown in a good light. Like you get in like for the Percy Jackson series, you have Nico and his sister Bianca, I can't remember those names, who are children of Hades. And it's like, just because they're children of Hades, it doesn't mean they're bad people. And they can often use their powers for good.
Yep.
Like, you could summon a skeleton army. That's not necessarily evil if you use it for good. It is neutral. It depends on what you do with it.
Yep. Yeah. I think similar to that, in D&D, and in a lot of fantasy worlds as well, but specifically in that I know of, I love that in those games and worlds, devils aren't portrayed as pure evil. They're just portrayed as like another race that sometimes have a tendency to do evil things. But like a lot of the times they have like contracts, like, oh, I want your soul, but I'll give you this in return. Or I will help you in this way if you help me in this way.
They're just lawyers.
They're basically just lawyers. And like in like Baldur's Gate, in Skyrim, and I'm sure other worlds that have devils, the devils there are no worse than some of the bad humans. Like, like in Baldur's Gate 3, I know I keep mentioning it, but like if you've played it, Gortash, who is a human man who decides to basically make a deal with his devil god, Baal. Baal? Bane.
Bane.
And to basically control the world, overthrow the city, and rule as a monarch. Basically. Pretty evil thing. He does it in like a relatively civilized way, as civilized as an evil maniac can be.
Sure.
But like he's not just going around killing people. He like has this plot where like, oh, I'm gonna get this guy that I'm friends with to pretend to invade the city, so I'll stop and I'll be the hero and everyone will bow down to me so I can rule them. But then like he's just as evil as the devil who's saying, oh, I want your soul, but I will give you these powers to help with the upcoming fight. And I think that's a really cool way. I do think the black and white portrayal of good and evil is boring. It's outdone. It's not that interesting.
I would agree, which is funny because Lord of the Rings does it so well. It really is good and evil. And I think it's almost like it's the best example. And it's like Lord of the Rings is just so good because it was kind of one of the first to do what it did at the scale that it did. And so it's a great, it has so much going for it. But once you see Lord of the Rings and then you see 3 other things that are copies of Lord of the Rings, it's like the gray area for me is often so much more interesting.
Yep.
Because it makes you sit there and actually think going, oh, this like there are multiple ways to go about this and there's not one right way.
Yeah. Well, I think The Witcher covers that perfectly because like with Geralt being a Witcher, his whole role is to sort of slay monsters, get paid, move on to the next thing. But because the world that The Witcher is set in at that time period, most of the witches are gone. They're almost like a forgotten relic at this point. There's only a few left in existence. And the monsters, they're dwindling, but Geralt still has a job to do. But then there's a lot of moral conflicts he gets caught up in. Geralt ends up getting caught up in political conflicts and things were like, oh, these monsters aren't actually evil and they have feelings, so do I kill them because I'm paid to, or do I like not? And like the humans, like one of Geralt's biggest things that he says time and time again in the book, the TV show, the games, is that a lot of the times humans are the real monsters. So you're playing, so it's not, oh, humans v monsters, it's, oh, I need to make a moral decision about what's the smart thing to do in this situation.
Yeah, and a lot of times it isn't. I feel like in Arcane, there's a lot of like grays involved. There's a lot of characters where at one point in time, you're like, they're doing an absolutely fine thing. And then the next moment you're like, that was a little psychotic. Like Jinx is a really fun character because she's very like, she starts off very,
innocent,
good and innocent and becomes, and then you're like, okay, well, she's working for the quote unquote bad guys, but then you like the bad guys have a little bit of a point.
And the bad guys like saved her life as well and are raising her.
Yeah. The bad guys might not be doing it the right way because arguably you shouldn't just be killing these people, but you can argue the people that are above them, both I think literally and figuratively, are killing them just in a different way.
And oppressing them and everything. They're just trying to fight back. Yeah. They just want their own country. It's like any civil war. So you could argue, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then Jinx screws up and she starts killing people for no reason, and like it gets worse and worse, and it's like, oh, are you doing these for the right reasons anymore? Are you just psychotic?
Yeah. And those are really the more interesting stories because it's like it kind of allows you to not question morality, but like see interesting moral dilemmas in a way that you don't in real life because they just don't present themselves, Or they do present themselves in real life, but because they present themselves so often and it's talked about in school and history and the news, like the opinion has been formed already.
Yep.
And I say that and I have no good example, but like,
I mean, like it's a basic example. It's not always true, but like in the real world, almost unequivocally, murder is seen as a bad
murder's
thing.
bad.
Whereas
Murder's
in a lot of
bad.
fantasy, murder can sometimes be a very good tool to create a lot of good, and it can be in the real world as well. But like, not many people are going to say that. Oh, okay, there's probably a good amount of people that will say killing Donald Trump's a good thing, but like realistically,
morally, it's not.
It's not. You shouldn't kill people for no reason. Like in a fantasy world, killing a tyrant king is pretty much always seen as like a positive thing.
Almost always. A lot of times it's the main goal and solution. I mean, arguably, that's what Lord of the Rings is. They're killing Sauron. He's not fully a physical being, but like they are killing his soul essentially.
Yep.
Whereas like if you you can't do that. But also I think if you said you can go back in time and kill Hitler, you kill Hitler.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's a bit gray, but yeah, in the fantasy world, you typically have a bit more room for like merging stuff there. Like, I don't know, in a fantasy world, you probably have more, what's the word I'm trying to think of? More real estate to like go ahead and beat the fucking shit out of someone because they're causing someone harm. Whereas in the real world, you'll just get taken to court.
You'll just be arrested.
It's just fucked.
Well, there's some times where like I'm watching a TV show and at no point do I ever condone murder in real life, but I'll be watching like a show or like something that's fantasy, and it's like I'll sit here and go, I think his only option is just to kill this guy. Cause like they're endangering the other person's life.
Yep.
And I mean that happens in real life, but not in the same way.
It's not something
also, like any story is.
The average everyday Joe is not going to kill someone because they're threatened a bit.
Yeah.
Whereas in fantasy, that happens a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I think, in fantasy and really in every story, oftentimes the characters aren't the average everyday Joe.
Yeah.
And if they are, it's like they start as it and then, they're the main character and blah, 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 blah. But like, that's the other thing is, and that just comes down to storytelling.
Yeah.
I live an average life. I go to work. I eat food. I come home. I like go to events. Like my life isn't in grave danger all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Where in a lot of times in fantasy worlds, that's the case. And it's interesting to kind of see that perspective. And it also like makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's one of my favorite like thought experiments or things to think about is not just in fantasy, but in TV, movie, games in general, is that time is something that is messed up a lot to give you a more enjoyable experience. So like in the Lord of the Rings, the time between when Frodo leaves the Shire and reaches Rivendell is like a month or two, but it's like 20 minutes in the movie. Because if it's
presented as maybe a couple days in the movie.
Because if you showed all of it, it would be very boring. It's the same thing as like I used to get really depressed, like watching like sitcoms, because I'd be like, I wish my life was like that. And then you're realizing
like
a
that
20-minute episode, maybe like a week's worth of their life. And like, if you could like even if the sitcom is still more interesting,
highlights.
It's a highlights. But even if a sitcom is still more interesting than my life, because they're made to be. If you took my past week and made a 20-minute short video of everything that happened, you could probably make my life look really cool or really interesting. But it's just not like that, because you're there every second of every minute of every hour.
Yeah.
Whereas in TV and movies and games, you're seeing like months happen in minutes, and you're like, wow, I wish that was my life. I guarantee Frodo and the boys were bored as shit when they were walking.
I'm sure there were a lot of like, so how about this weather? Shut up, we've heard that already.
Yeah.
Like, I think the whole adventure takes like over a year.
Yeah, it does. Well, and even in the books, technically, which they cut this out, which is crazy. From the moment that Gandalf finds out that Bilbo had the ring to the moment that Frodo leaves the Shire, it's 17 years.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
They just don't do that. I think it's interesting because they've been talking. I think there are talks about doing a like the Hunt for Smeagol movie or whatever it's called. I can't remember. Where is that time period between Bilbo leaving the like having the ring and being like, I'm gonna leave the Shire, and then he leaves the ring for Frodo, and then Frodo leaving, because like you said, it's like 17 years.
Yep.
Well, Gandalf goes and does his own research, and he's like, oh, we gotta find Smeagol.
Yep.
He is like the only person with information, and like he brings Aragorn along for it, and like there's a whole story there.
Mm-hmm.
And like I don't even remember if I don't think it's in the Lord of the Rings. It might be like, it's probably an appendix, because Tolkien also writes weirdly, and he sometimes writes like a novelist and sometimes writes like it's a textbook.
Yep.
And so in the Lord of the Rings, there's a bunch of appendices, and they're just a bunch of different things that happen. And I think that's one of them, or it's a separate book. I can never remember.
Who knows?
His work is confusing to follow, especially considering I don't have like print copies of everything, and I can put it in front of me. Like it's all like YouTube, like stuff I've seen on YouTube.
I've just been watching like one YouTube channel, and I've just been laying on the couch, just like listening to every single video. I'm like, yeah, this is great.
Nice.
This is awesome.
Yeah. There's so much content with the Lord of the Rings.
Okay. I got a question for you.
Okay.
How do you feel about the idea of a main character being like the chosen one versus just a regular guy?
It gets old.
Because
it can be good, but it gets old.
Because I was watching a video recently, and it was comparing Harry Potter to Frodo. And Harry Potter is very much the chosen child.
He is the chosen one.
Whereas Frodo, even though he had Bilbo as his granddad, uncle, something?
Uncle.
And like Bilbo did crazy things. Frodo, by definition, is just a random hobbit. Like people in the town.
He's technically nobility.
Yeah, he's technically, but like, well, okay. Among hobbits, he's nobility and seen as like very smart. He's seen as the best hobbit among hobbits. But you take Bilbo and put him into the real world, everyone's like, who's this fucking short dude? Like no one cares. Whereas in Harry Potter, from the second he steps into Hogwarts, everyone's like, oh my god, praise the boy.
Oh fuck. It's the boy who lived.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I find the more average Joe more interesting, or at least someone that's not the quote unquote chosen one. Yep. And I think you could have someone that is kind of a chosen one, but isn't necessarily. Like, I think the main character in JJK isn't the chosen one, but like,
well,
kind
of. I think we find out later that he's actually from a descendant from like a very famous like sorcery family, and he's like super powerful.
Never mind.
Well, okay, this is
from my knowledge, he's not.
Yeah, this is a big spoiler for One Piece, so if you don't want spoilers, don't listen.
It'll only take you 600 episodes to catch up to whatever point Dan's at.
1,015.
In this story. I know it's 1,000. I was picking a random number.
Yeah, no, it's like 1,000.
Because I don't know what point of the story you're talking about. So
this big revelation happens like 1,050 episodes into the anime.
Oh, so it's like pretty recent.
Yeah, somewhat.
Relatively?
Past few years. So Luffy, the main character in One Piece, he eats a devil fruit, which is a thing that gives him the power to stretch. Very, very iconic, stretchy boy. And for the longest time, people were like, oh, this devil fruit, it turns his body into rubber, and he's very creative with his powers. He like makes his fists really big and has like a giant punch. He like twists his legs together and like spins around and does like a giant spinning move. He's very, very creative with his powers, and it's like a really cool thing. But then we find out in like chapter something 1,000 that his devil fruit is not the gum fruit, the rubber fruit, which people thought it was. It's actually a mythical fruit that is based on a god called the sun god Nika. Nika, not the other bad word. Don't get me demonetized.
Yeah.
And the sun god was a person that used to exist about 900 years ago, 1,000 years ago or something. And people said that this god his body was made out of rubber. So this fruit was made in his image. And Luffy is now the chosen one who was meant to bring back peace to the world because of this. And it's a very controversial thing.
Yeah, I could see that.
A lot of people are very annoyed by it because they were like, dude, this random kid is managing to get this far and this strong just through sheer creativity, and now they're like, he's just a god. Like,
yeah, actually, it's also introducing that over 1,000 episodes in is crazy.
Yeah.
Like you have it's not even like, oh, it's like season 2 and they introduce it. It's like you have 1,000 episodes of like this creation of this character, of like this belief, like you said,
yep.
Everyone's going, oh, he's just some kid that's really creative with the powers he's been given, and that's what makes him so special.
Yep.
Oh no, actually he's a god, and it's just like, I don't know. I feel like it takes so much away.
From what I've watched, I don't think it takes away everything he's done up until that point, because like there's situations like if he wasn't the right person, like he still wouldn't have been able to use the powers and get to where he was. He's still very creative. Sure. He's still a good fighter. He's still smart in terms of combat. But yeah, it does have this element of like the 1,000 episodes leading up to that, I think that it doesn't take away from, but every moment from now onwards,
after that,
you're like, oh, well, he's obviously gonna he's the main character. He's gonna win every fight everywhere, anyways. But like now, it's like, oh, he is like he's these godly powers on his side, because his powers now, they used to just be rubber. They're still rubber oriented, but now he can he basically has Toon Force at this point. He can basically do whatever the fuck he wants with. He can affect the ground. He turned his body into like a giant baseball bat and hit someone. Or like he makes the ground turn into like spikes, or like it's cool. It looks fun to see on screen. Yeah. It's difficult to explain. It does work, and it does look cool.
Okay.
But it does change.
But does it work for the power set that the character?
I think so. I think it does work. Yeah.
Okay.
It does inherently work, but it also inherently changes how people now perceive him as a character. He is now the chosen one rather than some random guy. It's the same with the Elder Scrolls. In the Elder Scrolls 5, you're the Dragonborn. You are the chosen one to take down Alduin. Whereas in Oblivion, I think you're some guy. I think you're just a prisoner. I think you become something afterwards, but at the start of the game, you are just a prisoner. I'm pretty sure.
There is. Oh God, I'm trying to remember. The problem is I've actually started Oblivion like a couple times, and I've gotten somewhat far into that game, but I never finished it. I think you're just a guy. You maybe saw something, and that's why the king is like, "Hey, I need to talk to you."
Well, I know, but you're not even the one that kills or defeats the demon in the end. It's the descendant of Tiber Septon who defeats him.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I think in Morrowind, I think you also start out as a regular guy, but you become this figure. You become this guy called the Nerevarine, who becomes like this, basically very strong fighter figure person, like almost godly like. But yeah, in Oblivion, I don't think you're anyone special. You can correct me if you're wrong. Whereas in Skyrim, you are, and it inherently changes the way you see the world and how the world plays around you.
Yeah, it is, especially in like a role-playing game. It's really fun to kind of start as nothing.
Yep.
Or if you want, you choose where you start. Like maybe you start an ability, but like you don't start as a powerful god. You become the powerful god.
Yep.
And I don't think it's done terribly in Skyrim, because honestly, most people don't know who you are. So you're like a chosen one that no one's aware of.
Yep. And they just diss you all the time.
I mean, slowly over time. Well, that's true. They do diss you a lot. But like slowly over time, because like in this case, the chosen one, the dragon one, is like a myth. They're like, this hasn't existed for like
hundreds of years,
1,000 years. Yeah, hundreds of years or something like that. Like, oh, you can't actually be real. But then slowly over time, you kind of prove that you are. And they're like, oh shit, like you're the real deal. And that is a kind of fun twist to like the chosen one.
Yeah.
But I think I'd rather them just go, you're just some guy, and then you yourself become whatever you become.
Yeah. I think the best way to do the chosen one type character is to have a reluctant hero. Someone who's chosen, but they don't want to accept the role they've been given, and they're reluctant to go on this journey, and they have to overcome some sort of internal strength to be like, okay, I'll take this on and do it myself.
And I feel like they often are. At least in the good stories. Like we go back to like Harry Potter, I feel like a reluctant hero, or like he's the chosen one, but also doesn't know anything and kind of like has to learn about the world.
Like
Percy Jackson is the same, where like he is just thrown into this world. And he's like,
I think Frodo is also another example because like Frodo takes the ring.
He didn't want to take the ring.
He takes the ring to the first Rivendell, the first elven town, and then there's this big council. Like, okay, what do we do with the ring? How are we going to get it to Mordor? And they go around like, is the human going to take it? No, he's going to be overwhelmed by power. Is the dwarf going to take it? No, he's too heavy-handed. Is the elf going to take it? No, he, for whatever reason, I can't remember. And then after...
Honestly, I think it's mostly that they'll just be corrupted by the power.
Yeah, and then after they go through all the options, Frodo's like, fuck, fine, I'll do it myself. I'll take the ring.
I'll do it. And a lot of times during the journey, he's like, fuck, I hate this. It's kind of funny where he's like, what are we doing? And that humanizes this supposedly godly. I mean, he's not a chosen one, I don't think, at this point, but like this kind of like all important character and main character humanizes a lot of like, God, what am I doing here?
Yeah. This isn't fantasy anymore, but maybe another reluctant hero to a degree. I think he's changed now a little bit, but it's Invincible. Because there are not all, like, obviously he's very hyped to get powers. What teenager wouldn't love to be able to fly? But there are definitely points throughout the story where he's like, I don't want this responsibility, because we're now at the point in the story in Invincible where like he's like the only one strong enough that could possibly stand up to the Viltrumite Empire, and he's like he gets overwhelmed with this responsibility put on him, and he doesn't want to do it, but he has to because he's the only one that has the ability to do so.
He also, and kind of like a Spider-Man kind of figure, because I feel like they're similar in that sense of like, he also like likes doing superhero stuff. But at the same time, he's like, I want to live like a normal life. Like he spends the first 2 seasons trying to stick with Amber. And a lot of people hate Amber. And I don't love a lot of the story around her.
Yeah.
But I don't think she's like the worst. Because a lot of times you have like, oh, this is the bad relationship.
No.
Like, I don't think she's terrible.
She's just a regular girl dating a superhero, man. It's difficult.
Like, it's just difficult. And it's like, it sucks to see because it's my issue is that it was a repetitive trope of every single time it's, oh my God, I want to hang out with Amber. Oh, but I gotta fight this thing. And then she gets all pissed.
Well,
or in the second season, it's more she gets all sad.
I will say it did pay out because season 3 spoilers, minor spoilers, when he does eventually get with his new girlfriend, spoilers, Eve.
Yes.
There's a great scene where, like, on their first date, he is late because of a superhero thing, and she's like, "It's fine. We signed up for this." So it's like, oh my God, finally. We have this. Good.
Yeah. It's also, I think, partially because she's a superhero, she can hang out with him in ways that Amber couldn't.
Exactly. Yep.
Because, like, they could fight crime together. Or if he's like, man, I just fought crime and I'm over here, she could be like, I could just fly over there.
Yeah. And going back to the point you said about he just wants to live like a regular person.
Yeah.
I brought up a list of, like, reluctant heroes. And there's one that we haven't mentioned that may be maybe the single best example of reluctant hero. Aang from Avatar, The Last Airbender.
True.
He is a 10-year-old kid. He's literally 10 years old, thrust into one of the biggest wars his world has ever seen, with the Fire Nation killing his entire kind. He's been put into a hyperbolic time chamber for 100 years. He comes back, and the world is fucked. And now a 10-year-old with no mentor, with no airbending teachers, has to save the world. He's like, bro, I just want to play.
I just want to say we were thinking about fantasy worlds that weren't medieval, and like this is a really good example. I've been looking at you this entire time, and you have an Avatar poster right behind you.
Hey, even your name is fantasy, technically. That's fantasy as well.
Yeah. Fuck, you have Pokemon stuff behind you? That's fantasy.
Yeah, we're dumb.
Yeah, we're fuck. I'm sure I have stuff behind me that
you have Fallout, Skyrim. You have Skyrim.
I have Fallout, Skyrim, which I don't actually think you could see in the video.
I can see it.
Right up. It's right up there. It's above the Fallout and Helldivers poster, which are both more sci-fi than
Well, like I always talk about my favorite fantasy worlds, and I do think. Well, let me pose the question. If you could be transported to any fantasy world and you would get some of the powers in it, which one would it be? because I've had my answer on lock for like a decade at this point.
You've definitely told me, and I definitely can't remember. Avatar is a really cool one.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's my well, see, my issue when you ask this question is I feel like I've lost all like memory of what fantasy worlds exist, and you're gonna say one, I'm gonna be like, damn, that's a good one.
Well, what you think? My answer is, and probably always will be, specifically the Legend of Korra era of the Avatar world. Purely because there's a bit more technology in it than the Avatar Aang era. Like there's like sporting events and there's like cities. I think I'd be able to adapt to that more than like the Avatar Aang world. The Last Airbender is more like villages and like medieval, whereas Korra is like a bit more. That's actually a great example. We're talking about like fantasy worlds that aren't medieval. Legend of Korra is a perfect example. They literally have like a New York City,
but it's all technological, but it's explained by bending, which
is magic.
I would say inherently is magic.
Yeah.
God, you're so right.
Hey, speaking of Avatar, new series announced, so that's cool.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
What was it again? Tell the people. And
there's going to be twins. One of them is going to be the Avatar, and one of them I think is just either a regular Earthbender or just like a random person.
So this is after Korra.
It's after Korra, and I'm not gonna lie, I really love Korra. I enjoy it as much as the original series, which is I'm gonna get backlash for, but Korra's been getting some insane heat on social media because let me actually get it up because it's very interesting. What the plot line for this new Avatar show is. Where is it? Official synopsis for Avatar 7 Havens. A world shattered by a devastating cataclysm, a young earthbender discovers she's the new Avatar after Korra. But in this dangerous era, that title marks her as humanity's destroyer, not its savior. Hunted by both human and spirit enemies, she and her long-lost twin must uncover their mysterious origins and save the 7 Havens before civilization's last stronghold collapse. So, basically...
That sounds cool.
It sounds cool, but according to that, Korra fucked it real bad, which I hate.
Honestly, I'm going to be real with you. Not a surprise.
Yeah.
She's kind of a mess. I've only seen the first season, so I don't know the rest. I've heard... And you can give me your opinion on this. I've basically heard that some seasons are really good and some seasons are really bad. Season
1 and 3 are phenomenal. Season 2, I personally like, but it is quite a bit worse. And then season 4 is a bit like... Season 4, they kind of try and do like the whole like Fire Nation storyline in one season. With a tyrannical earth bending like matriarch overlord woman. I think it's all right. I think the start of season 4 is fantastic, and then the ending falls off because the start of it, it's like a 2-year time skip or something. And Korra's been she's been heavily traumatized from the events of the past season. So she's going through she basically has like the Vi pit fighter thing from Arcane, but for like a long period. And she has PTSD massively. She still has like mercury in her blood, which is like fucking up her bending abilities, and she like can't fight the same way. And it's like a bit of a recovery. I think that does really well, but yeah, it does fall off a bit towards the end. She is a mess. But like the whole thing with Avatar is that the past Avatar, the issue, like the things the past Avatar did well, the next one usually does badly. It's like a very consistent like back and forth cycle. It's like the Avatar before Aang, Kyoshi, was known for being like very hot-headed.
Nope. Roku. I mean, Kyoshi is before him, but not directly.
Like Roku, like he like
Roku's very level-headed.
Roku's very level-headed, but he fucked up with like the Fire Nation, and that caused the issues that Aang had to deal with. Aang was very, very like peaceful and loving, but being so peaceful, he ended up letting a lot of people get the better of him with like bloodbending and a lot of like evil, tyrannical individuals. And then Korra had to deal with that with like being a heavy-fisted, basically militant type avatar. But then her lack for being compassionate probably led to this new conflict.
Yeah. It is interesting. I do like the world quite a bit.
It is a very cool world.
I feel like the technology advanced so much in Korra from just the original Avatar, that it makes me wonder how much more does it speed up.
Well, from the sound of it sounds that because of what Korra did, that the society, like the civilization's on, it says it's on their last strongholds, so they might be back.
So it's probably it's more apocalyptic.
Yeah, it seems like it, which is cool. It sounds cool.
Which could be interesting.
Yeah.
I just want a Daltang.
Well, he's in Korra for a little bit. I mean, flashbacks, but yeah. I mean,
sure.
J.K. Simmons is Tenzin.
Like a whole series. That's true, and that is pretty fun.
It is cool. Yeah, so back to you. Any idea what fantasy world you'd like to be in?
Oh god, I looked at an entire list, and I think the ones that I'm really more aware of are all kind of similar. And like you have, again, stuff like the Lord of the Rings. You have Elder Scrolls. You have Westeros. You have Hyrule. You have like all of these things where it's like arguably really similar.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think, because you also don't want to throw yourself into a world where it's like the stories are really cool, but also there's a lot of like death and suffering. And
yep. Like being an Attack on Titan would be a fucking nightmare. You would not want to do that at all. Like that's why I think Avatar or Korra, whichever one you pick, isn't too bad. Because like the chance of having bending is like pretty high. I think it's like 80% or something. And bar the war of the firebending and stuff, like you can live a pretty chill life in that world and not have too many issues.
I do think I would like the Avatar world. I mean, I'm always partial to Nirn, which is like Elder Scrolls.
Yeah, me too.
Dan, if I said Gielinor, how would that make you feel?
That's close enough.
I had a feeling I'd mispronounce it, and I think that's almost better.
It's Gielinor.
Same thing.
So that's RuneScape.
Gielinor.
That's RuneScape.
There we go. That is RuneScape. I'm looking through a list of fantasy worlds, and I was like, what if I just find the stuff Dan likes and I just throw that at him?
I haven't mentioned this podcast, but RuneScape is one of my favorite fantasy worlds as well.
Yes.
Also very similar with like the god system's quite different. You don't have like god of the ocean. You just have like sort of like these, like you have like the god of balance. You have the god of good, but he's like good but lawful good. So like he's happy to do bad things if it has good outcomes, in a sense, which is interesting. And then you also have, this is another trope I actually really like, and it happens in Baldur's Gate 3 with Gale, what happens in RuneScape with Guthix, the god of balance. It's the concept of regular humans can ascend to godhood due to things happening to them. So like in RuneScape with Guthix, he was a regular human, or not human, he was a regular like alien from a different planet from Gielinor. And there was this massive event called the God Wars, or like this was a past God War, not the main one, where gods were fighting, one of them died and he dropped his weapon. Guthix picked up the weapon, and because that weapon was infused with so much godly power, he became a god. He took that weapon, or I think he took the weapon, killed the other god, and then he ascended to godhood, which is really cool. And then in Baldur's Gate 3, one of the endings for Gale is he can become a god as well, which is like
that's pretty sweet.
I think it's pretty cool that that's like a thing. Cool. It's not like a rigid like these are the gods, these are the humans. There's no in between. It's like you can become a god, and even in some situations, gods can become like mortals if they're like thrown out by Zeus or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, I think sadly, I think Hyrule would be a very fun fantasy land purely, and I feel like it'd be nice and peaceful.
Yeah.
And then Link fucks some shit up, but like,
because
I don't know, it feels like a good vibe.
I always see on Reddit or TikTok like the questions like, if you got dropped, let's say Skyrim, because we both know Skyrim very well.
Sure.
If you got dropped into Skyrim right now, and you got to choose which city you could start in, but do you think, with the knowledge you have of the game, do you think you could actually survive?
Like you are, like you as a person.
You're not
have no knowledge.
You have no magic ability, but you have the ability to learn it. It's like if you go there, if you went to the College of Winterhold, you could learn magic, but you could learn magic. You're not the Dragonborn. Do you think you could survive in that world?
Sure.
Yeah. Why not? What would you do?
Because
I love laying in bed at night and thinking like, if I got dropped into this fantasy world, how would I survive? For me personally, I think the easiest thing generally would be join the Bard's College, because we
true.
We both know how to play music. We're both musicians. to a degree.
We could do something there.
I could learn, like, honestly, I want to learn the lute. The lute is such a cool instrument.
Lute's a cool instrument. God, I'm trying to think of where I'd start.
I mean, you wouldn't want to start
I feel like
in like Riften or Markarth. You would be fucked.
No, because like you don't want to do the Thieves Guild. You don't want to start in Dark Brotherhood, obviously. You could maybe start in Whiterun. Start as like kind of a chill farmer. And then maybe join the Companions if you want to become strong.
Yeah, I think Whiterun or Solitude are the only real good options.
Yeah, I feel like I was going to say the same thing. It's Whiterun or Solitude.
Like maybe you go College of Winterhold, but that's a miserable ass place to live.
It's a miserable ass place to live, but you could learn magic. But they also don't accept everyone, so I almost feel like you need to learn a bit of magic in the first place. And also, it just seems like a shit place to be.
It does.
So, yeah, I guess that. I don't know. I think, sadly, my answer is I don't have an interesting answer. And that's because I'm being indecisive. And a lot of these realms, like I said, from Tolkien, are really fucking similar.
That's fine.
It's also partially, I'd maybe pick the Avatar universe.
Yeah, I think it is one of the best because it's the magic system in Avatar. It's like, it's not the same as a lot of...
Pretty unique.
It's pretty unique. It's not magic. Like, it's the closest thing, but I wouldn't call bending magic.
Yeah.
It's slightly different. But it's very cool. It's also very simple.
It's mystical.
It's also very simple. Like, it's not like you need to learn these crazy incantations and spells. It's like, if you have the ability to bend, you just, like, do it.
You do it. The set of rules is very straightforward.
Yeah.
And there's some things that you can, like, fudge to like, kind of add more.
It's also based on, like, real physics as well.
Yeah.
Like, it's like...
Which is pretty cool.
It's like, everything in Avatar is based, like, roughly on real physics. It's like water can only move and do in so many things. Like you can't. It's not like they can teleport. I don't think there's any teleporting in Avatar.
I don't think so.
It's
they can move elements.
Yeah, they all function in ways they would be able to in the real world. Like airbending is basically just a giant, like, not vacuum, but a fucking. What's the opposite of a vacuum? A blower? A hairdryer?
Yeah, I guess.
Sure. Waterbending is a hose. Like, obviously it's more than that, but that
earthbending is a guy with a rock.
Yeah. I feel like learning, if I was dropped into the world of Avatar and I was the Avatar, learning that would be a lot easier than learning, like, spells in D&D.
Yeah.
Because, like, what?
Because it's like you straight up have to study.
Yeah, like, you'd actually have to, like, go to university for years and to, like, learn how to do this shit.
Mm-hmm. I think the world of Pokemon would be very fun, but I think the thing that holds me back is I wouldn't have powers the Pokemon would.
Yeah, and I feel like unless you have plot armor, you'd die very quickly from any Pokemon attack.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how Ash survives his Pikachu shocking him that much, but boy must be fried.
Yeah. Well, no one dies in that universe for the most part.
Yeah, true. Although
except in like some of the movies and stuff.
I would love my favorite little boy, Shinx. He's behind me there.
Yeah, there you go.
His glass.
I do love Shinx.
I found out that Shinx is like he's like 40 centimeters tall. So he's like the size of a big house cat. He's like a small dog.
He's a small boy. Small boy.
I love a Shinx. I'd give you away for Shinx in real life.
You'd give me away? Okay, I don't know how to feel because on one end, love Shinx.
Yeah.
I see my worth now. I see what I compare myself to.
Yeah.
That plushie behind you and that plushie behind you, me.
Yeah.
I'm right below it.
Yeah.
Right below it, right? Like it's a real close battle. Like you'd have a hard time with it.
Yeah.
Ah, wow, I don't believe that. Okay. Well, I'm gonna go cry. So I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah, go waterbend those tears.
I'm gonna go waterbend my tears.
Yeah. When you were in the shower when you were younger, did you used to pretend to waterbend?
Yeah, of course.
Good man.
Yeah, fucking, oh, yeah.
Yeah, who didn't?
Or you'd have the thing where you let water like drip down your hand and it like kind of flings off and you're like, oh, and you're not doing anything, but like felt cool.
Yeah.
Because you're 8. You have an
yeah,
imagination
8,
still.
not 23.
Yeah, 8, not 23. No, yeah, like at a much younger age and not right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna go in the shower and do nothing abnormal.
Oh, that gives a lot of freedom of thoughts for our viewers.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. That sounds worse than I meant.
Viewers, think about what Dan's gonna do in the shower and comment or don't, because I'm scared. Okay, bye.